I flew small aircraft for 32 years without incident. Cessna 172s mostly, sometimes a Piper Cherokee when the job required it. Crop dusting, aerial photography, the occasional charter flight for businessmen who needed to reach small towns without commercial service. I logged over 8,000 hours in the air, navigated through storms and mechanical failures, landed on improvised strips in conditions that would have grounded most pilots. None of that prepared me for what I saw over the Homachito National Forest in October 2019. I've told this story to exactly 3 people. My wife, who listened with the kind of patient silence that comes from 40 years of marriage, and didn't ask questions I couldn't answer. The FAA investigator who interviewed me after the incident, who wrote down everything I said and filed it in a way that ensured nobody would ever read it. And the ranger who found me 2 days after I went down, who looked at me with an expression that told me he'd heard similar things before and wished he hadn't. I'm telling it now because I'm 71 years old, and the weight of keeping silent has become heavier than the fear of being dismissed as unstable or unreliable. What I saw was real. What happened afterward was real. And the fact that I can't explain it doesn't make it any less true. The flight started as a routine job. A timber company out of Natchez needed aerial photographs of a section of forest they were considering for selective harvest. The area was deep in the Homachito, southeast of the main visitor areas, accessible only by logging roads that hadn't been maintained in years. They wanted shots from multiple angles, different altitudes, with enough detail to assess tree density and identify access points for equipment. It was the kind of work I'd done hundreds of times, simple, methodical, well paid. The job came through a contact I'd worked with for over a decade, a surveyor named Bill Henderson, who coordinated logging operations across 3 counties. He'd called me on a Tuesday morning and asked if I could fly the survey that same week. The timber company was on a tight schedule and needed the photographs before their next board meeting. I told him Thursday would work if the weather held. He said Thursday was fine and emailed me the coordinates and specifications that afternoon. I spent Wednesday doing the pre-flight maintenance I always performed before survey work. Checked the fuel system, inspected the control surfaces, tested the radio and GPS equipment. The Cessna was a 1998 model I'd owned for 12 years, maintained meticulously with an engine that had been overhauled 18 months earlier. It flew smooth and responsive, the kind of aircraft that becomes an extension of yourself after enough hours. I loaded the camera equipment that evening. A digital SLR with a telephoto lens, mounted on a gyro-stabilized rig that compensated for aircraft movement. Extra batteries, memory cards, backup equipment in case the primary system failed. Everything secured and double-checked because losing shots on a survey flight meant doing the whole job over at my own expense. Thursday morning came with high pressure and clear skies. I checked the weather radar and forecasts. Nothing but good conditions through the evening. I drove to the airstrip outside Meadville, a single runway operation with a small hangar and fuel pump. The owner, a retired airline pilot named Jack Moreau, was already there when I arrived. We'd known each other for 20 years and had an easy familiarity built on shared experience and mutual respect. He asked about the flight, and I told him it was a standard timber survey over the Homachito. He nodded and said to watch out for the wind shifts that sometimes developed over those ridges in the afternoon. I told him I would and thanked him for the fuel top-off he'd done the previous evening. The Cessna sat on the apron, white with blue trim, looking exactly like what it was. A reliable workhorse that had carried me safely through thousands of hours and would carry me safely through thousands more. I took off from the small airstrip outside Meadville around 3 in the afternoon. The runway was only 2,800 feet, but that was more than enough for a lightly loaded Cessna on a cool October day. The engine came up to power smoothly. The takeoff roll was normal. I rotated at 60 knots and climbed out to the east, banking north once I had 500 feet of altitude. The weather was perfect for photography. Clear skies, light winds from the southwest at maybe 5 knots, temperature in the low 70s. Visibility was unlimited. I could see all the way to the pine forests that marked the beginning of the Homachito. The air was smooth with none of the thermal activity that sometimes made photography difficult in warmer months. I climbed to 1,500 feet and headed northeast toward the coordinates the timber company had provided, trimming the aircraft for level flight and setting up the camera system. The Homochitto is over 189,000 acres of mixed pine and hardwood forest, streams and ravines cutting through terrain that's remained largely unchanged for centuries. From the air, it looks like an ocean of green, unbroken except for the occasional logging road or fire trail. In autumn, the hardwoods start to turn, creating patterns of rust and gold among the darker pines. It's beautiful in a way that makes you understand why people used to think forests were sacred. I'd flown over the Homochitto dozens of times over the years, always impressed by the sheer scale and density of it. There are sections of that forest where you could walk for days without seeing another human being, where the only sounds are wind and wildlife and the constant background noise of insects and birds. Flying over it, you feel small. You recognize that the world below has its own rhythms and rules that have nothing to do with human schedules or intentions. The forest doesn't care about your flight plan or your camera equipment or your timber harvest. It simply exists, vast and ancient and indifferent. I reached the target area around 3:30 and began my first pass. The coordinates placed me above a section of forest characterized by dense canopy and steep ravines. I could see a creek winding through the valley below, its water dark against the surrounding vegetation. The trees were predominantly pine with scattered oaks and sweet gums, their crowns forming a continuous layer that hid most of the ground. Here and there, I could make out breaks in the canopy where large trees had fallen, creating small gaps that let light reach the forest floor. The understory in those gaps looked thick and impenetrable, the kind of vegetation that would make walking difficult even with machetes and determination. I dropped to 1,000 feet and began the systematic photography pattern I'd developed over years of survey work. East to west passes at decreasing altitudes, each run capturing overlapping images that could be stitched together for comprehensive coverage. The camera fired continuously, the motor drive making a soft clicking sound that was barely audible over the engine noise. During the third pass, at about 800 feet, I noticed something that didn't fit the pattern. There was a clearing, maybe 40 feet across, in a section of forest where no clearing should exist. It wasn't a natural meadow. The trees surrounding it were mature and undisturbed, their canopies meeting overhead except for this one circular gap. It wasn't the result of recent logging either. There was no access road nearby, no equipment tracks, no signs of cutting or removal. The clearing itself appeared to be deliberate, as if something had removed vegetation in a specific area without damaging the surrounding forest. The ground inside the clearing was lighter than the surrounding forest floor, possibly bare earth or short grass. From 800 feet it was difficult to make out fine details, but the shape was too regular to be natural, too isolated to be man-made. I marked the location on my GPS and made a mental note to photograph it more carefully on the next pass. Unusual features like that sometimes indicated old homesteads or Native American sites, though this was deep in the forest, miles from any known historical settlement. The timber company would want to know about it before they started operations. Any kind of archaeological significance could delay or prevent harvest in that area. I banked the Cessna and came around for another approach, this time at 600 feet to get better detail. I adjusted the camera settings for the lower altitude and lined up on the clearing. The afternoon sun was still high enough to provide good lighting, and from this altitude I'd be able to capture clear images of whatever was down there. As I approached, I could see the clearing more distinctly. It was roughly circular, with edges that looked deliberately maintained rather than naturally occurring. The ground inside was indeed bare earth, lighter in color than the surrounding forest, and there appeared to be some kind of disturbance pattern in the soil, though from this height I couldn't determine what had caused it. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a bear. The size was right, and bears are common in the Homochitto. It was standing in the clearing, positioned near the center, and from my altitude, it appeared as a dark shape against the lighter ground. I lined up the camera and prepared to capture what I assumed would be an interesting addition to the survey. Wildlife shots always impressed clients, and a bear photograph would be something Bill could use in presentations about the ecological value of the forest. But as I got closer, maybe 200 yards out, The shape resolved into something that made my hands tighten on the yoke. It was not a bear. The creature was standing upright on two legs, fully vertical, in a posture no bear maintains for more than a few seconds. Its stance was stable and natural, not the awkward temporary bipedal position bears adopt when investigating their surroundings or trying to appear larger. This was something that stood on two legs as its normal mode of being. The proportions were wrong for any animal I knew. Too tall, maybe 7 feet or more, with shoulders that looked broader than any man's and a torso that tapered to a narrow waist. The arms were long, hanging past where human arms would end, and as I passed overhead at 600 feet, the creature turned its head upward and looked directly at my aircraft, not the startled glance of an animal surprised by noise, but a deliberate, focused tracking of my position. The head followed my movement across the sky with smooth precision, as if it had been waiting for me and knew exactly where to look. The head was canine. Even from that altitude, I could see the elongated muzzle, the pointed ears that swiveled toward the sound of my engine. But the head was too large for any dog or wolf, positioned on a neck that supported it with the kind of musculature you'd see in a large predator. The entire body was covered in dark fur that looked almost black in the afternoon light, though as the angle changed I could see it had a dark brown undertone, the color of wet earth or rotting wood. I've hunted deer and wild hog in Mississippi forests since I was 12 years old. My father taught me to identify tracks and scat, to recognize the sounds different animals make, to understand the difference between a white-tailed deer moving through underbrush and a feral hog rooting for food. I spent my teenage years in those woods, camping and hunting, learning the rhythms and patterns of wildlife. I know every animal that lives in those forests. Black bears, coyotes, bobcats, the occasional rumored mountain lion, though I'd never seen one myself. What I saw standing in that clearing was none of them. The creature watched my aircraft pass overhead with what appeared to be focused attention. It didn't startle or flee. It didn't drop to all fours and retreat into the forest. It stood there, completely still except for the head movement tracking my flight path. And even at 600 feet, I could feel the intelligence in that gaze. It was studying me the same way I was studying it, and there was something deeply unsettling about being observed with that kind of deliberate attention by something that shouldn't exist. I circled back, descending to 400 feet, telling myself I needed better photographs, that I had to document what I was seeing, because nobody would believe it otherwise. The rational part of my mind was already constructing explanations. Someone in a costume, though, who would wear a costume in the middle of an uninhabited forest, miles from any road. A misidentification, though I'd been identifying wildlife from aircraft for 3 decades and had never been wrong about something this obvious. Maybe it was a person, just an unusually tall person, and the distance and angle were creating an illusion of wrongness. But even as I thought these things, I knew they were excuses, attempts to force what I was seeing into a framework that made sense. The creature remained in the clearing, still upright, still watching. As I made the second pass, it moved, not away from my aircraft, but toward the center of the clearing, positioning itself in full view. The movement was fluid and purposeful, not the shambling gait of a bear on hind legs, but something more controlled and deliberate. Each step was placed with precision, weight transferring smoothly from one leg to the other in a way that demonstrated this was not an uncomfortable or temporary posture. This thing walked upright the way humans walk upright, with balance and natural ease. It raised one arm as I approached, and I saw the hand clearly. 5 digits, with the first positioned like a thumb, ending in claws that were visible even from my altitude. The claws were dark, maybe 3 or 4 inches long, curved slightly inward. The gesture looked almost like acknowledgement, as if the creature knew I was documenting it and didn't care, or wanted me to see it clearly, or was making some kind of communication I couldn't interpret. I took photographs. I don't know how many. My finger pressed the shutter button repeatedly while my mind tried to process what I was looking at. The camera's motor drive kept firing, the memory card filling with images that I knew would either prove I wasn't crazy or demonstrate that something impossible was standing in the Mississippi forest in broad daylight. Through the viewfinder, magnified by the telephoto lens, I could see details that made the situation worse. The fur had texture and depth, individual hairs visible in the afternoon light, moving slightly in the breeze that swept across the clearing. The muscles beneath the fur shifted with each movement, bunching and releasing in ways that proved this was flesh and bone, not fabric or costume. Nobody could create a costume that realistic, especially not one that moved with that kind of fluid naturalness. I made a third pass, lower still, at 300 feet. This was below the altitude I normally flew for survey work, close enough that I could hear the change in engine pitch as the air density increased. At that altitude, I could see details that eliminated any possibility of misidentification. The face, when I got the angle right, showed a muzzle filled with teeth that were visible when the creature's mouth opened slightly. The teeth were large, designed for tearing, the canines prominent even from 300 feet. The eyes caught the light and reflected it back with an amber glow that reminded me of a dog's eyes in headlights, but larger and positioned more forward-facing than any canine. The nose was black and wet-looking, positioned at the end of the muzzle in a way that suggested an acute sense of smell. The ears, which I'd noticed before, were constantly moving, adjusting independently to track sounds from different directions. They looked like wolf ears, pointed and mobile, but scaled up to match the size of the head. The creature's chest expanded and contracted with breathing. I could see the ribcage movement even from 300 feet, the fur compressing and expanding with each breath. This was a living thing, biological and real, standing in a clearing in the Homachito National Forest on a clear October afternoon while I photographed it from a Cessna 172. Its shoulders were massive, built for strength rather than speed, though I had the sense that something with that much muscle could move quickly if it chose to. The arms hanging at its sides showed definition through the fur, the kind of muscular development you'd see in a large predator that regularly took down prey with physical force. The hands, or paws, or whatever they were, looked capable of gripping and manipulating objects. The thumb position suggested opposability, though I couldn't tell if it functioned the way human thumbs do. Then something changed. The creature's posture shifted. The casual, almost relaxed stance it had maintained during my first 3 passes became something else. The shoulders pulled back, the head lowered slightly, the muzzle angling downward in a way that made the eyes more prominent. The arms, which had been hanging at its sides, came up and forward, hands flexing so the claws extended fully. I've seen enough predators in my life, watched enough big cats and wolves on nature documentaries, hunted enough game to recognize the change from observation to action. The creature was no longer content to watch. It was preparing to do something, and every instinct I had told me that something involved me. I pulled up, gaining altitude instinctively, adding power and bringing the nose up to climb away from whatever was about to happen. As I climbed, I saw the creature drop to all fours. The transition was seamless, instant, from bipedal to quadrupedal stance without any awkwardness or adjustment period. On 4 legs it looked even larger, built like a wolf but massively scaled up, with front limbs that were longer and more heavily muscled than any wolf's. The proportions made sense now in a way they hadn't when it was upright. This was something designed to run, to chase, to pursue prey across long distances. It began to run. Not away from my aircraft, but parallel to my flight path, matching my speed and direction through the forest below. I was climbing through 500 feet, airspeed building to 70 knots, and this thing was keeping pace with me on the ground. I could see it moving between the trees, a dark shape weaving through the forest with a speed that seemed impossible for something that size. It wasn't crashing through the underbrush or forcing its way past obstacles. It was navigating the terrain with precision, choosing paths that allowed maximum speed, using the natural openings in the forest to maintain its pace. I've flown alongside vehicles on roads, kept pace with trucks and cars to get aerial shots, and I know what 60 or 70 miles per hour looks like from the air. This creature was moving at that speed through dense forest, on uneven terrain, without slowing down or losing its line. I continued climbing, reaching 1,000 feet, and the creature was still below me, still running parallel to my course. I could track its progress by the disturbance in the canopy, the way branches moved as it passed beneath them, the brief glimpses of dark fur when it crossed small clearings or gaps in the trees. It was following me, not chasing randomly or fleeing in panic, but deliberately tracking my aircraft through the forest, maintaining a constant position relative to my flight path. The intelligence required for that kind of behavior was staggering. It had to predict where I was going, choose routes through the forest that would keep it beneath me, adjust its speed and direction continuously to match mine. That wasn't animal instinct. That was problem-solving and spatial reasoning at a level that most animals simply don't possess. I banked right, turning away from my survey pattern, heading west toward clearer terrain. The creature adjusted immediately, changing direction to follow my new course. I banked left, a sharper turn, testing whether it was really tracking me or just running in a straight line that happened to match my heading. It turned with me, emerging from the trees at the edge of a small clearing, and for a moment I had a clear view of it in full stride. The movement was powerful and efficient, the front legs extending forward and pulling the body along while the rear legs provided thrust. The tail, which I hadn't noticed before, was extended behind for balance, maybe 2 feet long and covered in the same dark fur. The whole animal moved like a machine designed for one purpose: pursuit. I realized my hands were shaking on the yoke. My heart was pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my chest, in my throat. I'd been flying for 32 years, and had never been afraid in an aircraft, not during engine failures or severe weather or any of the dangerous situations that occasionally arise in small planes. But I was afraid now, not of crashing or mechanical failure, but of the thing running below me, matching my speed, tracking me through miles of forest with what appeared to be predatory focus. It wanted something from me, and I had no idea what or why or what would happen if I gave it the opportunity. I checked my fuel. 3/4 of a tank, enough for another 2 hours of flight time. I looked at the GPS. I was 6 miles from the nearest road, 8 miles from the nearest town. The forest stretched in every direction, unbroken green canopy that offered no safe landing spots even if I'd wanted to put down, which I didn't. The absolute last thing I wanted was to be on the ground anywhere near that creature. I increased power, climbing to 1,500 feet, and pushed the airspeed to 90 knots. The Cessna wasn't built for speed, but I could maintain 90 knots indefinitely, and that should be faster than anything on the ground could sustain. The creature kept pace for another 3 miles. I watched it below me, still running, still tracking, showing no signs of fatigue or slowing. Then, abruptly, it stopped. I saw it emerge into a larger clearing, maybe 100 feet across, and come to a halt in the center. It stood there on all fours for a moment, then rose up onto its hind legs again, standing fully upright. It watched my aircraft continue westward, growing smaller with distance, and even from 1,500 feet and increasing range, I could feel its eyes on me. It had let me go. Not because it couldn't keep chasing, but because it had chosen to stop. That realization was somehow worse than being pursued. The idea that I'd survived not through my own actions or the capabilities of my aircraft, but because something had decided I wasn't worth the continued effort. I flew west for another 10 miles before I felt safe enough to turn back toward Meadville. My hands were still shaking. I was breathing too fast, almost hyperventilating, and I had to force myself to slow down and focus on flying the aircraft properly. I ran through the standard procedures, checking instruments, monitoring engine performance, maintaining altitude and heading. The familiar routine helped calm me down, gave me something concrete to focus on besides what I'd just seen. I tried to convince myself I'd misidentified something, that stress or fatigue or unusual lighting had created an illusion. But I knew that wasn't true. I'd seen what I'd seen, and the photographs in my camera would prove it. Except they didn't. When I landed back at Meadville and downloaded the images to my laptop that evening, I found something that made my stomach drop. The photographs were corrupted. Not all of them, just the ones from the clearing, from the passes where I'd photographed the creature directly. The images showed digital artifacts, blocks of distorted pixels, color shifts that made the photographs unreadable. I'd used the same camera and memory card for hundreds of flights without any issues. The photographs from the beginning of the survey, before I'd seen the creature, were perfect. The images from after I'd fled west were also fine. Only the critical photographs, the ones that would have provided proof, were destroyed. I spent 2 hours trying data recovery software, pulling up partially corrupted images that showed fragments of the clearing, pieces of dark fur, what might have been a clawed hand, but nothing definitive, nothing that couldn't be dismissed as image compression errors or corruption artifacts. It was as if the universe itself had decided that what I'd seen should remain unproven, known only to me and whatever that thing was in the forest. I called Bill Henderson the next morning and told him I'd completed the survey but had equipment failure that destroyed some of the photographs. I'd need to fly the mission again to get complete coverage. He wasn't happy about the delay, but he understood equipment failures happen and scheduled me for the following Thursday. I didn't fly that Thursday. I called Bill Wednesday night and told him I was sick, which wasn't exactly a lie. I'd barely slept since the first flight, waking up multiple times each night with the image of that creature burned into my mind, standing in the clearing, watching me, running below my aircraft with impossible speed, rising up on its hind legs to track my departure with what I could only describe as intelligence and intent. I told Bill I'd reschedule when I felt better. He said to take my time and feel better soon. I never rescheduled. I told him a week later that I was dealing with personal issues and couldn't take the job. He found another pilot, someone from Natchez who flew the survey without incident and delivered photographs that showed nothing but trees and terrain. I kept flying for another 8 months, taking jobs that kept me away from the Homachito, working surveys in other parts of the state. But something had changed. Every time I flew over forest, I found myself watching the canopy too closely, looking for clearings that shouldn't be there, searching for shapes that didn't match the patterns of normal wildlife. The joy I'd always found in flying was gone, replaced by constant vigilance and a low-grade fear that I couldn't shake. In June 2020, I sold the Cessna to a flight school in Jackson and retired from aerial work. I told my wife it was time, that 32 years was a good run, that I wanted to spend more time at home. She didn't argue, but she knew something was wrong. She'd known since that October evening when I came home, pale and shaking, and wouldn't talk about the flight. The FAA investigator came to see me in November 2020. I'd filed a report about the equipment failure, the corrupted photographs, because that kind of failure needed to be documented for insurance and liability purposes. He asked routine questions about the camera system, the memory card, the conditions during the flight. Then he asked what I'd been photographing when the corruption occurred. I hesitated, knowing how it would sound, but something in his expression made me decide to tell the truth. I described the clearing, the creature, the pursuit through the forest. He wrote everything down in a small notebook, his face neutral and professional. When I finished, he asked if I'd told anyone else. I said just my wife. He nodded and said that was probably for the best. He said there had been other reports from that area. Not many, but enough that certain people paid attention. He said the forest was larger than most people realized and that there were things in remote areas that didn't interact much with human populations. He said my report would be filed appropriately and thanked me for my cooperation. I asked him if he believed me. He looked at me for a long moment, then said it didn't matter what he believed. What mattered was that I'd seen something that frightened me badly enough to end a 32-year career, and that whatever I'd seen was consistent with other reports from the Homachito. He said I should consider myself lucky that I'd been in an aircraft rather than on the ground. He said people who encountered these things at ground level sometimes didn't come back to file reports. Then he left, taking his notebook with him, and I never heard from the FAA about it again. The ranger who found me, I haven't mentioned him yet because that part comes later, after everything else. 3 weeks after the FAA investigator's visit, I got a call from a man who identified himself as a district ranger for the Homachito National Forest. He said he'd received my contact information from a colleague. He didn't say who, and wanted to talk about my experience in October. We met at a diner in Meadville, and he brought a folder full of reports and photographs, sightings going back 40 years, tracks that didn't match any known animal, clearings that appeared and disappeared without explanation. He said his father had been a ranger in the same forest, and his grandfather before that. He said his family had known about these things for 3 generations, and that knowledge was carefully controlled, shared only with people who'd earned the right to know by seeing something themselves. He showed me photographs that looked like what I'd tried to capture from the air, Dark shapes in clearings, partial images of something large and bipedal, tracks in soft earth that showed five-toed paws with claw marks. He said there were probably a dozen of them in the Homachito, maybe more, living in the deepest parts of the forest where human presence was minimal. He said they were territorial and generally avoided contact with people, but occasionally someone stumbled into their range or, like me, observed them from a position they found interesting rather than threatening. He said the pursuit I'd experienced was unusual, that most aerial sightings involved the creatures watching and then disappearing. The fact that it had chased me suggested either curiosity or a warning, a message that I'd seen something I shouldn't have and should stay away. I asked him why nobody talked about this publicly, why there was no official recognition or scientific study. He said there had been studies, decades ago, conducted quietly by people who understood what they were looking for. The conclusion was that public acknowledgement would create more problems than it solved. Panic, invasive tourism, hunting parties trying to kill or capture them. The Forest Service and certain other agencies had made a decision to keep it quiet, to manage the situation through controlled information and strategic discouragement of reports. Rangers who saw things were transferred or encouraged to interpret their experiences differently. Hikers who reported encounters were told they'd seen bears or were mistaken. The whole system was designed to maintain the status quo, to keep these creatures hidden in the vast forests where they'd existed for centuries or longer. He told me I should be grateful I'd survived the encounter, that being in an aircraft had probably saved my life. He said the creatures were intelligent and dangerous, that they'd killed people over the years, deaths that were attributed to accidents or animal attacks but were actually the result of encounters gone wrong. He said the best thing I could do was forget about it, move on with my life, and never go back to that part of the forest. I told him I'd already decided that. I told him I'd sold my plane and retired from flying. He nodded and said that was probably wise. Then he collected his folder, paid for my coffee, and left. I never saw him again. I think about that day constantly. Not every day, but several times a week I'll be doing something ordinary and the memory will surface, standing in that clearing, watching my aircraft, running below me with speed that defied physics, rising up on its hind legs to track my departure. I wonder what it was thinking, what it wanted, whether it understood that I was documenting it or cared about being seen. I wonder how many other pilots have seen similar things and stayed silent, afraid of ridicule or consequences. I wonder how many people have encountered these creatures on the ground in situations where there was no aircraft to provide safety and distance, and what happened to them. I haven't flown since I sold the Cessna. I miss it sometimes, the freedom and perspective that comes from being in the air, the satisfaction of a well-executed flight. But I don't miss flying over forests, don't miss the constant vigilance and fear that developed after October 2019. I'm 71 now, and I spend my time on the ground, where things are predictable and explainable. My wife and I travel sometimes, take road trips to visit grandchildren, enjoy retirement in the way people are supposed to. But I don't go into forests anymore. I stay on paved roads in populated areas, places where the trees are decorative rather than vast and concealing. If you fly small aircraft over remote forests, pay attention to clearings that don't belong. Watch for shapes that don't match normal wildlife patterns. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong, and don't descend for a closer look at anything that makes you uncomfortable. The photographs aren't worth it. The proof isn't worth it. Some things in this world are better left unexamined, better left to exist in their own territories without human interference. I learned that lesson at 300 feet over the Homachito National Forest, and I've carried it with me every day since. The creature I saw that October afternoon is still out there, still living in those woods, still watching the sky when aircraft pass overhead. And I'm here, on the ground, grateful to have survived an encounter with something that shouldn't exist but does.